Oh, yeah.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for persevering and thank you for staying for the final session. My name is Paul Burke. I'm a professor here at the Crawford School of Public Policy, head of our Arndt-Corden Department of Economics and Deputy Director at the Crawford School. It's great to welcome you to this final session, which is on momentum towards clean energy in Asia. We have a great panel lined up to talk about this topic, and just a reminder, questions are very welcome. Please do add them to the website listed above, the vbox.app website, and we will have some time for questions and answer during the session today. The session today is looking at the trajectory of the energy transition, and what we're going to be doing is looking at some key countries in the region: Vietnam, Indonesia, Japan, and also the region as a whole. To get us started, I'd also like to pay my respects to the Ngunnawal people, the traditional custodians of where we are here in Canberra. On the call today, we also have participants joining us from a range of countries in the region, including Thailand, Laos, Vietnam, Indonesia, the Philippines, and elsewhere as well. So a big welcome to our online participants and looking forward to your questions coming in. I will briefly introduce our speakers and then they'll each be talking for about 5 minutes to get us started. Our first speaker is Dr. Thang, who is sitting just next to me and is a research fellow here working in our Grand Challenge project, which is called Zero Carbon Energy for the Asia Pacific, which is a project that brings colleagues from around campus together to work on how Australia can be changing our export model towards a clean energy export model, and also looking at policies and frameworks for uptake of clean energy throughout the region as well. Thang is an expert on energy in Vietnam and the ASEAN region. Joining us online, we have Dr. Mika Ohbayashi, who is director at the Renewable Energy Institute in Japan and has been so since its foundation in 2011. She has a long list of former roles as well, including working for the International Renewable Energy Agency, IRENA. Our third panel member is Professor Budy Resosudarmo, who is a colleague here working at the Crawford School of Public Policy, is a professor in economics at Crawford School. Budy works on Indonesia's economy, and today we'll be talking about prospects for clean energy in Indonesia. Finally, we have Associate Professor Aisbett, who is here at the College of Law at ANU and is also our Associate Director of Research for our Grand Challenge project, Zero Carbon Energy for the Asia Pacific. Emma works on international agreements related to clean energy and other things as well, and we'll be taking a regional perspective today. So let's get straight into it. And our first speaker will be Dr. Thang Do, speaking on Vietnam. Over to you, Thang.
Thank you, Paul. Good evening, everyone. Today, I would like to share with you a picture about renewable energy that I've been sketching recently. And okay, and I think, yes, here we are. Specifically, I will talk about the 3D picture of enhancing solar and wind power in Vietnam. Now, the first D that I would like to start with is it's desirable for Vietnam to transit from fossil fuel to solar and wind power. Why is it desirable? Because transferring to solar and wind power would help Vietnam to achieve the net zero emission target by 2050 that it committed at the COP26 last year. Vietnam has a lot of solar and wind power, about 100 times the current capacity of the installed capacity of Vietnam can come from solar and wind power. And also, Vietnam is one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change, and transitioning to renewable energy, including solar and wind, will help to mitigate climate change and also address the local air pollution. Solar and wind power costs have been falling fast, so Vietnam could achieve affordable energy with solar and wind. So it's desirable, the first D of the picture. The second D, it's demanding, as you can imagine, for a developing country. Fast growing population, 100 million people now, with the electricity consumption growth rate of about 10% per year over the last decade, and projected to continue with that fast increasing demand for the next decades also. So how could Vietnam transit to solar and wind from an entrenched, well-established coal power? A lot of barriers ahead, including, first of all, transmission grid. The transmission grid is old and has not kept up with the fast growth of solar and wind recently. It takes about 3 to 5 years to complete a transmission grid project, whereas it takes only about 6 months to complete a solar farm project. So curtailment has happened when Vietnam started the boom in solar some years ago. Also, regulations and institutions are not well developed yet to enable, to facilitate solar and wind. For example, it would take a proposal of wind power project to go through around 10 ministries, several years to get approved. So very, very long time. And also capital cost for investment in solar and wind is huge. It would cost around 30 billion US dollars for Vietnam to just upgrade the transmission grid alone by 2030. So a lot of capital cost, a lot of investment will be needed. So that's the second D, demanding for transitioning to solar and wind. The last D I would like to talk, and this is perhaps the biggest D among the 3 Ds, is it's doable. Now, if you look at these figures, we can see that Vietnam has jumped from almost zero solar and wind power in 2017 to over 20 gigawatt power. So 200 times in just 4 years. And since 2019, it overpassed other countries in Southeast Asia to become the leader in the region in terms of solar and wind. It's doable. What were the drivers for such a boom in solar and wind in Vietnam? Our study shows that the application of feed-in tariff, which is the incentive to sell power and of solar and wind to the grid at an attractive price, attracted a lot of private sector investment, and that helped. So it's desirable to increase uptake of solar and wind, demanding but doable. And this picture hopefully can continue in the future, that Vietnam has committed to net zero emission by 2050, and they have been working hard to try to incorporate that commitment into the current power development plan for the next decade. So that completes my brief 3D pictures. And I hope you will remember the 3D pictures of a transitioning from fossil fuel to renewable energy in a developing country context. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thang. And the Asia Pacific really is a very vital region. It has more than 50% of the world's population, more than 40% of world GDP on purchasing parity terms, and a lot of energy use in the Asia Pacific and very rapid growth in that energy use as well. One of the very important countries, of course, is Japan, and our next speaker will be providing an introduction about what's going on in clean energy in Japan. Mika, are you there? Over to you, Mika Ohbayashi. Very much looking forward to your talk. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction. I totally envy for those gathering in Australia. I'm just speaking from very chilly Tokyo now. Probably that I'm a giant. Okay, I just tried to introduce the Japanese situation now. Can you see my slide now?
We can see it.
Okay, great. Just a moment. Okay, I just tried to, so the globally the renewable is now the cheapest energy source, but you can still in Japan, like fossil fuel power is the cheapest source of energy. Target for renewables compared to other countries.
Mika, we're having a bit of a problem with your connection. Can you hear me?
6 to 38% by 2000. That other developed nations such as European countries.
Mika, can you hear me? We're having a bit of a
Oh
problem
yes,
with your.
I hear you very well.
Okay, we might actually
so probably that
we have a problem with your
I'm sure this works, but probably this works better. Paul?
Yeah, we just need to, can you improve your Wi-Fi connection or move closer to the Wi-Fi portal?
Yeah.
Maybe turn off the video.
Yeah, actually that it's really difficult because it's a kind of a tethering I'm working on, so.
It's better now.
It's better now? Okay, and then you see my slides, right? So the Japan's target that by 2030 is quite low. So I think that we have to improve this one. And then that if you see that the historical development of renewables until now, you could see that we introduced the German type of feed-in tariff 2012. So we could increase that renewables, especially variable renewables, and especially the solar power just expanded like a 75 gigawatt by the end of last year. But still, if you compare with other countries such as US, UK or Germany, which is quite similar, like kind of for the industrial structure, and then renewable energy potential, it's quite similar, that we started from 2000, like 10% of renewables in the energy mix in Japan, but we could increase from 2012 to the 20%, but still, if you compare with other countries, it's still timid. And then also Japan's self-sufficiency of fossil fuel is quite low. So what the thing that we have to do is, to have the independent energy source such as renewables has to be expanded. But currently, the Japanese government policy is to focusing on the continued use of the fossil fuel, especially the hydrogen ammonia that from fossil fuel to be used that in Japan as well as in Asian region. That is a government proposal. And now Japan is taking the lead of influencing other Asian countries to take the coal as a coal ammonia path. So I think that we have to stop this trend. And then for the expansion of renewables, I think that we need a kind of a cheap renewable energies at the kind of various, at the vast scale, large scale. But it used to be said that the Japan's renewable is still expensive, as I showed you that previously. But now, recently, because of the high price of fossil fuel, even in Japan, the renewable energy is becoming cheaper. You could see the fossil fuel prices at like here. It's just a fuel price. But compared to the 2 years ago, coal was at 2.3 Japanese yen. So it's about the 2 cents, US 2 cents per kilowatt hour, but now it is more than 16 cents. And the LNG, that the price is soaring. So it is that the 22 cents. It's not the barrel. It has to be kilowatt hour actually for the LNG, but still very expensive now. So we have to capture this opportunity as not the negative opportunity, but the positive opportunity to accelerate the renewable energy expansion in Japan. For doing that, we need the more higher target of renewables that by 2030, and then actually middle is our study for 2030, which was released 2 years ago. And at that time that we proposed more than 45% by 2030, but now we understand this is not enough. We have to have more, much higher target for 2030 as well as 2035 that we have to aim the predominantly renewables in the electricity mix, and then reaching the 100% of renewables by 2050. And then this is our 2050 scenario. And then for doing that, we need a kind of a flexible demand in the demand side sector. And then also we have to enrich the transmission system, domestic transmission system first, and then probably in coming future that we can think of that connecting our grid system to other countries such as Korea and China to share the huge amount of renewables in that region. That is my proposal at this time. Thank you very much.
Right, thank you very much, Mika. And moving on to our third speaker, Indonesia and Australia, we share some similarities. Australia is the world's #1 coal exporter, Indonesia #2. Indonesia has a lot of opportunity in clean energy, geothermal and solar and others, and challenges, a lot of work to do. Our third speaker, Professor Budy Resosudarmo, will introduce the situation and make some comments regarding Indonesia. Over to you, Budy.
Yeah, thank you very much, Paul, and thank you for all of you to coming to this conference. So what I'm going to do is to provide information on the opportunity of energy activities in Indonesia, but also provide you some understanding on the driver of those opportunity. So Indonesia is among the top global emitter in the world. And international pressure to Indonesia to do something is big. And international pressure matters in terms of Indonesia willingness to develop policies in this sector. So if some of the big international country fail to do so, it less incentive for Indonesia to actually perform. So international pressure is important. Indonesia actually react toward that international pressure. So the second commitment, so this is the formal Indonesia NDC, but this is the second commitment for Indonesia. The first commitment was stated by our previous president, and the second commitment is that Indonesia will reduce the emission about 29% below business as usual by itself by 2030 and up to 41% with international support. The first commitment was 2020 and it's not really happening. So this is actually the second commitment, and there is some additional commitment last year, and also there is some revision in just this year on the target. So the biggest change of this second commitment and this first commitment is Indonesia commitment on energy sector. So the first commitment during our previous president, most of them are in forestry sector, about less than 10% on energy sector. Right now on this commitment, about 35% is on energy sector. So why it is that? Well, one thing that I will argue is that the government, people in Indonesia see commitment in forestry do not bring any foreign direct investment, very less than foreign investment. commitment in energy could bring a lot of direct influence. So the second characteristic of Indonesian commitment in this area is that whether or not there will be investment in the energy sector. Without investment in the energy sector, it won't happen. So that is important to understand all these commitments. So I've mentioned, I repeated, I mentioned two. One is international pressure, and second is whether there is an investment or not. So on the energy sector, the way that the Indonesia thing is relatively simple. So Indonesia, in Java, electricity has been well supplied. So in a way, it's already full supply. And problem is that a lot of them are coal. Just closing up those coal is need to be something to replace. So the strategy is that let's first, at least in the intermediate period, build renewable outside Java, the big one, thinking about connecting to Java. An example of this line underwater is currently built, Madura and Java, and then start phasing out the electricity in Java. And then after that, you move toward electric vehicle and then greening up the industry. So there is also a company for the policy is carbon pricing. But although it is already in the law, as I mentioned, if international do not do that, Indonesia won't do that. Why they would like to do it? So that is the main strategy. And important on this process of renewable and so on are investment coming in. And without investment coming in, it will be difficult. So my final slide is about what are the opportunities. Now, for international collaboration, yes, there has, after G20, there has been announcement on all those commitment and so on. But whether it will happen or not is actually still a good question that we need to ask. Remember that the first Norway commitment, $1 billion was failed. And so whether this further commitment is happening or not. And the key to me is that whether we could actually collaborate on the knowledge technical cooperation for micro policy development, because a lot of regulation and policy in Indonesia has not providing a healthy environment for those capital to coming in, as well as translating into a better energy transition in Indonesia. So for Australia, I think Australia has the opportunity to support Indonesia on that aspect, and then all this international commitment can smoothly come to Indonesia, and so the energy transition is happening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Budy. And our final speaker, last but not least, is Associate Professor Emma Aisbett, who will be talking about the role of regional cooperation here. Emma.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you so much, Budy, for setting up my presentation so nicely in your final slides. So as you have heard, there's lots of challenges for all the different countries individually in the region. And as Budy so well pointed out, we will need to work together if we're going to pull this off. We've heard from the Japanese about connections, actual sort of physical connections in terms of trading renewable electricity. We need finance to cross borders. We need trade in renewable energy-based products like green hydrogen and ammonia. And to underpin that, we need governance and regulatory collaboration. And we're seeing enormous efforts in that regard emerging throughout the region. And I'm proud to say that Australia is actually one of the leaders in this area. And so what we're seeing is the emergence of what I call international green economy collaborations. And they can be everything from a simple joint statement of intent, as Budy just mentioned, to full-on signed and ratified agreements like the Australia-Singapore Green Economy Agreement. There are lots of these emerging around the world, but in the region, in addition to the two I mentioned, of course, Australia's low emissions technology partnerships. I think we have I'm looking to my colleagues in the government here, 6 or 7 of those at the moment, with countries around the world, including Japan and Korea. And of course, there are bigger sort of agreements that have these green economy aspects to them, and the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework is a key example of that. So the way I think of these agreements is doing 2 things. On the one hand, they're a form of international green industrial policy. So where we think of domestic green industrial policies sort of addressing market failures that are inhibiting the growth of domestic green industries, international green industrial policy is trying to address market failures that are inhibiting the growth of cross-border green supply chains, right? So if you think of chicken and egg problems where Australia doesn't want to invest in making lots of green hydrogen until we know there's going to be a demand at the other end. And similarly, people don't want to build their green hydrogen economies until they know someone's going to supply it. That's the chicken and egg problem. And that's exactly the sort of thing that these collaborations can help to address. The other thing that these collaborations can help to address is potential conflicts from our individual green industrial policy efforts. So you've seen perhaps a little bit of this sort of thing in the news, the European and Japanese and other countries' responses to the American Inflation Reduction Act, for example. So a massive piece of green industrial policy. But what we're seeing around the world, of course, is the desire by governments to not only achieve sort of environmental objectives, but potentially domestic political objectives and geopolitical objectives. And this is where green industrial policy can potentially be problematic, particularly from the perspective of the traditional economists who worry a lot about discrimination and barriers to trade and investment. And as we've said, free trade and investment are going to be key to pulling this off. So these green economy collaborations are a form of a pathway to regulatory collaboration that can try to minimize those trade and investment distortions arising from our individual green industrial policy efforts. So in conclusion, I think this is a really exciting and very important regulatory evolution that we're seeing happening very quickly at the moment. But we will all need to sort of try to tame our demons in terms of vested interest capture and political and geopolitical objectives in our green industrial policy and in these agreements, as we know all too well from the failures of traditional industrial policy. So thank you very much for listening and for sticking with us late in the day, late in the year.
Thank you very much, Emma. And we have a lot of time for Q&A, and I would like to get us going, and then let's go to an online question. My question is about the role of state-owned enterprises in the region. We have some very important state-owned enterprises in the energy sector in countries including Indonesia and Vietnam, and they operate in a different way. They're not really in the market economy, and the system is a bit different to what it is here. So I wonder if colleagues could comment on how to get these state-owned enterprises moving. Is it an advantage to have an SOE when a government has a net zero target, or are there challenges there? And Budy, I wonder, would you like to start on Indonesia?
Well, the state-owned enterprise in Indonesia is actually simple and difficult. They listen to the president. And so if you have a president that is pro to the climate, they will behave on that. But if you don't, it will be difficult. They just keep playing chicken and chicken and egg in terms of change. So I have been advised each time I would like to discuss with the National Electricity Company. Have you discussed it with the Ministry of State-owned Enterprise? You know, without this, you cannot, because all the commissaries and the director is appointed by the Ministry of State-owned Enterprise and listen to the recommendation of the president and the Circle 1. So, you know, as a director of state-owned enterprise in Indonesia, especially the bigger one, what you have to do is satisfy your boss. But, yeah, I simplify those things. Okay. Yeah, and
Thang.
Yes, I think that similar case also applies to Vietnam. 70% of coal power plants in Vietnam are state-owned. And that presents a challenge. I would start with challenge first, because those would expect the government to subsidize for them to reduce their coal power and phase out coal power. And the state budget is limited, right? And there are so many priorities: health, education, road infrastructure, and so on. So it would be hard for the government to increase their subsidies to that state-owned enterprises of coal power. That's a challenge, I think. But also it would have the kind of advantage of, as Budy said, that, they will listen to the government more and will follow the direction from the government. So if the government has clear, strong directive toward clean energy, then the SOE would be more likely to follow than the private sector. Thank you.
Mika, would you like to join in? You're on mute, Mika. We can't hear you.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now, right?
Yes.
And actually that in Japan, not so much state-owned enterprises are quite active or something like that, but actually that we are rather focusing on non-state actors' actions now. One of the projects that we are doing is the Japan Climate Initiative that is called the non-state actors, such as the big enterprises or the local authorities to join our initiative to how can I say, in line with the Paris Agreement. So the under 2 degrees and then that close to the 1.5 degree, that was the kind of a starting point. Sorry that some noises, I'm at the kind of one of the ministry and then they are something doing the construction now. So, and then that we started in 2018. It is kind of a year after the 2 years after the Paris Agreement got into enforced. And then that was a kind of a lead by the some enterprises that they would like to take more action in climate change, because the at that time, Japanese government action was quite low. There's no declaration for carbon neutrality or the higher NDC on the ground. So they want to show that enterprises, business sector can do more in the climate actions. We started with 150 companies such as Sony, Ricoh, and Hitachi, and then those kind of big companies. But now that we expanded more than 700 members. So I think that those non-state actors' actions can be accelerate the atmosphere towards that the climate favorable actions in the society. And then in accelerating that kind of actions, push the national government to go forward for the more ambitious climate change targets such as NDC. So not the governmentally owned enterprises, but in Japan, that the private companies are quite active, tried to take actions. That's a kind of the influence by the international initiatives, such as, ILE 100 or something like that, that big companies are requesting their supply chains in Japan to become the greener. So those actions has to be coordinated globally, and then the companies that in each country like that could have opportunity to take actions.
Great. Thank you very much, Mika.
I'm obliged as an international economist to make the obvious comment about there are potential strengths if you get alignment between climate policy oriented government and state-owned enterprises, and we're hoping that's what we see in Victoria. But of course, the challenge is always either way, whether they're investing heavily in renewables or whether they're trying to maintain fossil fuels, is the impact on private investment, particularly foreign direct investment. And we all know that no government has the budget to do all of this energy transition on their own. And so I think we do need to try and concentrate those sort of direct state investments in the places, you know, in things like transmission, where you have very strong natural monopolies and network externalities.
And Emma, there is a question online about Singapore and the Australia potential to be exporting electricity to Singapore, the big proposed Sun Cable project, a very famous one that's working towards financial closure at the moment. The question is, what would Singapore need to reduce its risk exposure or to feel comfortable and happy to be entering into this type of arrangement contractually or in other ways? How can that relationship work? What institutional framework is needed?
That's an excellent question. I had the same thought, particularly looking at Mika's discussion of the connections between Japan and China, for example. So whenever you've got a direct power connection, for example, a pipeline between Russia and Germany, you obviously have huge amounts of two-sided hold-up and geopolitical risk. And managing that is going to be key if we get regional electricity grids happening. Two things, you're much more likely to see this between like-minded liberal democratic partners like Singapore and Australia. I think there's no coincidence that that's the first green economy agreement that Singapore chose to sign, and likewise for Australia. But there are also, you can never sort of trust that governments won't change over time. So there's two other things you can do. One is you can use international investment law, which we've seen will potentially only get you so far. For example, if the guns come out, as they have in Europe, everyone's kind of thrown up their hands and just left the Energy Charter Treaty because they realized it wasn't helping them with the Russia situation. So the biggest thing you can do is have many connections and don't be reliant on just one partner, either for offtake or for supply.
And if you're in the room, please let me know if you'd like to ask a question and we'll send the mic over. I'm just going to ask one more question and then we'll come straight to the gentleman for a question. My question is about the role of Australia and the opportunity for Australia to be contributing to a clean energy transition in the region. Of course, we already have a lot of activities underneath the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and in other ways as well. But there's a huge opportunity, isn't there? We've seen Australia's moving quickly to solar and wind. What more could we be doing to underpin this transition in the region? And Thang, I wonder your thoughts.
I think that Australia has a lot of potential for exporting its huge solar and wind power to the region. Although there are risks of cross-border electricity trade, I think that still some opportunities for Australia to export to countries, for example, Singapore, high demand of electricity, and other countries as well, and also in the forms of, for example, green hydrogen. The demand for hydrogen is increasing in the region. Even in some countries like Vietnam or Laos, people start talking about using hydrogen in 2030s, so not far away, quite near. And also another sector that I'm thinking about is the green industry. Still, if Australia can use its solar and wind power to produce steel here in Australia and export, then it would be a great example of green product by Australia.
Budy.
Yeah, I would like to add Thang comment. To me, what is a big opportunity as well is on the knowledge sector, which is improving the knowledge of the region in terms of how to actually implement energy transition, because to me it is a key. If they can actually rearrange some of the regulation, some of the policy, and some of the thinking within the region, that will be a formula for the success of the transition. Just having a capital is probably not enough. There's a possibility of conflicting interests that actually create a conflict, and that's something that we do not want, because then it will, they just said, well, forget it about this. Yeah. So for example, if this phasing out of coal power plant created an issue within, although this is within a local government, if there is no much local government buying on these activities because the compensation that coming in is not basically reduce the effect, any negative effect, that could be backfire for the whole thing. So I thought that helping the region in rearranging what are the regulation and policy thinking, particularly precisely on the energy transition, is important, and Australia abundant on those ability.
Emma.
I obviously agree with both. It's sort of between you summed up our grand challenge, I think, pretty well, the export of ideas as well as green products. And obviously my own personal bent, you know, exactly taking the lead as we are with Singapore on this international regulation. A great example is embedded emissions accounting, which is the sort of thing that you need to underpin trade-related climate policies to be able to respond to things like European carbon border adjustment mechanisms. These are very demanding on bureaucracies to develop these new frameworks. And so Australia, as it did with other carbon accounting practices in the past, develop high quality systems that can then be shared in the region and used by others.
Mika, any thoughts on Australia?
And then at the current situation, for example, that between Japan and Australia, the Japanese government tried to import the gray-based hydrogen from Australia. But previous speaker already mentioned that there is a possibility to have the green hydrogen production in Australia, and then it could be exported to other countries. And then also not directly between Australia to Japan, but Australia rather close to other Southeastern nations, such as Indonesia and others. Maybe that the transmission system, interconnection could be established between those countries. And then the Australia can be an exporter of the green electricity that based on the variable renewables. And then that will help the region to stabilize, to use that a lot of amount of renewables in the region. But by doing so, I think that we need a kind of a bilateral or the international framework to have the certificate of the tracking system of the hydrogen. Or we have to, at least that we have to use the same terminology. What is a green? What is a blue? What is a something or some those kind of things that we have to establish and then introduce to use such green energy in that region.
Thank you, Mika. Let's go to audience questions. Yes, please.
Thanks. I just wanted to ask the panel about the transition away from coal. Like we heard earlier in the day that Australia's fleet of coal-fired power stations are retiring simply because most of them are old and near their end of their useful life. But much of the coal-fired power infrastructure in many countries in Asia is relatively young, and does that and would keep operating for quite some time in the absence of climate or other environmental policies. Is that young age of that infrastructure create any challenges for the transition, and how are your respective economies handling that challenge?
Budy.
Thank you very much. So there is actually an issue here. So the government realized those things. So for example, in Java, the plan is still, the first one is still 2035. So that is the first phase. Because why? Because there is the age of some of the coal power plant now, but international pressure would like Indonesia to do it faster. And the first one, probably the one that there's an agreement with ADB. And so, but how actually the money coming in and being used is still a question. And this one is a private sector, the one that the first one that the government picked to be an example, actually owned by a private sector in north of Java. So yeah, there's been a challenge. So the private sector is willing if it is full compensated, but the full compensated might not be cheap. So that has been discussed. But yeah, I cannot give 100 answer about that.
This is a very relevant question for Vietnam's case as well, Thang.
Yes, I would see as one of the most challenges to energy transition is phasing coal power. For example, in Vietnam, the country has been struggling to balance between the climate commitment and whether it will continue with the coal power plant. And it took several years and a lot of effort for the country to come to the decision that it will stop building new coal power plant after 2030. Although it may sound not very ambitious, but it took a lot of efforts in the last 5 years or so for many debates, many discussions among the government agencies, among stakeholders to come to that decision. And in my opinion, although it may sound not ambitious enough, I think it makes sense because Vietnam still needs a lot of electricity in the next decade or so. And it just cannot happen overnight, over a week, over a month, or even over a year to transit to solar and wind. So it needs something to continue, right? Because otherwise the economy will collapse. So I think that coal power still need in a transition, right? But in the meantime, of course, the country would need to look at how to phase down and then phase out coal. And in the meantime, importantly, how to uptake, increase, accelerate the uptake of solar and wind, so that when the coal power start to reduce, to phase out, we have something in place in the transition. So that's my opinion.
Let's go for more audience. Mika, over to you.
Yeah. I mean, that I just would like to ask the professor that how do you see the time frame that you mentioned, like a coal will be still play a role in the transition period, but how do you see the time frame?
I think it depends on each country, right? For Vietnam, with that increasing electricity demand and not many opportunities, not easy fixed solution yet, then I think that, you know, the time frame of continue with the currently in the construction phase of coal power plant might make sense. So it depends on each country situation. That's my quick answer.
And there was a hand up right in the center, Penelope. Over to you.
I want to thank the presenters for a really interesting presentation. I've got so many potential questions I want to ask, but I guess I wanted to focus people on what is actually happening already. There are many different efforts to decarbonize in different countries with international support. And are there lessons for us going forward based on what we've done already? Whether it's things that worked or things that didn't work, because we're on a journey of decarbonizing together, and it would be really wonderful if there are observations you have about that could inform Australia's international cooperation going forward, whether it's through green economy agreements or official development assistance, or setting up organisations like the Global Power Systems Transformation Consortium, which has been there now for a few years, and it's set up to help developing economies adjust. So I'm wondering, what are the lessons? Where are the gaps? Where are the successes or failures even for us to learn from going forward?
Emma, would you like to have a go?
Actually, I was hoping that one of my colleagues.
Well, we could start with Vietnam's case because Vietnam really raced ahead in the adoption of solar power. Thang, lessons learned from it.
Yes. So initially, I described about the boom in solar and wind in the last 4 years or so in Vietnam, but I didn't mention in detail about the cons of that process. Now, the first one is the planning, right? The country didn't plan that such a boom will happen in such a short time. So the transmission grid planning hasn't kept up with that solar and wind generation. So the first lesson, early preparation. Other countries in the region might want to start thinking about the preparation investment in grid to prepare for sooner or later boom in the countries in terms of solar and wind. I think the second lesson perhaps is institutional arrangements. Right? Policy need to be certain, because in the case of Vietnam, although it had feed-in tariffs, quite generous, quite good one, the policy were uncertain. Now there's no incentive mechanism, and a lot of investors are waiting to see what happened next. And that uncertainty also costs costs to investors. So two perhaps big lessons that could be drawn from Vietnamese case.
Other panelists, Budy.
Well, Indonesia do not have much success experience because it is still very new. But I thought that in the last 5 years, there is an opportunity that we could actually use. So my observation on the national electric company, professionally, they're becoming better. So for example, if there is a cut off of electric in one region, they respond it relatively properly. Now, so you see that the professionality in this national electric company is actually improving. It's not yet as the private sector, a private company. So the key to, so there's an opportunity actually to make them more friendly toward renewable. So the important thing is actually now is at the leadership, whether we do really have a government that pro environment or not. It seems to me it is important, and Indonesia is going to have an election in 2024. So that is actually a big thing for Indonesia.
We're getting close to time, but over to you, Emma, and we'll come to you as well, Mika.
Sorry to disagree, Thang, but I think it's super important to understand that green industrial policy is a process of systematic learning. You're never going to have policy certainty because you don't know in advance the unknown unknowns. Vietnam's case, Spain ended up with 40 billion euros in investor-state disputes coming at them because their feed-in tariff had to be lowered because the entire country was going bankrupt because solar prices had dropped. And so that got too much demand. So I think one of the big lessons learned is understand that your policies will change, but try to have systematic learning and updating processes so at least it's predictable change as opposed to erratic change.
Mika.
Yeah, I have to say, like kind of the Indonesia and Vietnam, that both countries has some carbon neutral target, that Vietnam is 2050 and Indonesia is 2060. And then Japan has that 2050. And then we have to be hand in hand that to go for that target. As I showed that the current situation, that even only the fuel prices, the fossil fuel is totally extremely very expensive. So keeping the current existing coal-fired power plant is very expensive. And then introducing the new solar power or wind power, and then also offshore wind power potential, if we think of that, that could be extremely cheaper than continue to keep the fossil fuel power plant. That I think that those are the kind of things that we have to think of. And then what's not the kind of only the market price, but also that what's the cost that we are really paying for is showing us the direction that we are going forward.
All right, thank you, Mika. And 6 p.m. came around very quickly. I think also 2050 will come around relatively quickly too. Huge opportunities in the region in clean energy, but also huge challenges as well. And I think the session tonight, we really saw that each country is a bit different too, and the local context is very important. So I'd like to invite you to please thank the panel and have a great night, everyone. Thank you very much for joining.
This concludes Energy Update 2022 from all of us today. And thank you very much for joining us. We hope you found it useful. If you did, tell your friends. And please join us in thanking everyone who made this work so smoothly behind the scenes. So AV team, thank you very much, caterers, but very much in particular the team at Aisbett, who run these events so very professionally. In this case, very much in particular, Renee Jones and Nicole Ferronda. Thank you very much. Please feel free to hang with us a little bit. Also, if you're in the mood, the Unipub is open till 8, 110 meters across the road from here. Have a great summer and please stay in touch.